Most people stretch their hamstrings completely wrong. In this video, I'm going to show you the best exercises you could do to 10x your flexibility here. What's up, Dr. Nick here to go over how to actually stretch your hamstrings more effectively. Most people actually stretch their hamstrings ineffectively because they're not taking into account pelvis positioning. In this video, we're going to take into account the pelvis positioning and how it plays a huge role in how you're performing stretches to your hamstrings. So we got to really peel back the layers and scale back and think about what we're actually doing when we're stretching the hamstrings. Now, the hamstrings are located on the back of the thigh. Okay, and they have attachments to the pelvis and they run down your back of your leg and attach to parts of your knee. So if we take the hamstrings where it attaches into the pelvis and it goes to the knee, it runs like this. Now the action of the hamstrings are to bring the leg back into hip extension and then also bend the knee into knee flexion. So the complete opposite motions of that to stretch it is bring the hip into hip flexion and then also bring the knee into knee extension. Now, we have to consider the pelvic positioning. Now, there's what's called a posterior pelvic tilt and an anterior pelvic tilt. Now, if we're thinking of where the hamstrings actually attach, if we want to stretch this part more, we have to bring this part of the pelvis away from the attachment sites down below. So in order to do that, we got to tilt the pelvis this way, forward, into an anterior pelvic tilt. So that classic anterior pelvic tilt actually stretches the hamstrings a little bit more. And then a posterior pelvic tilt slacks it a little bit. So if I bring the pelvis backwards, we're then essentially taking these attachment sites and getting them closer, slackening the hamstring muscles, versus tilting it forward, we stretch it. So pelvis positioning, stretch or slack the hamstrings. So when you're performing stretches, you want to keep this in consideration, and this is how you can actually 10x your mobility here by just getting more specificity to when you're stretching. So let's get into it. So let's put this into practice and actually go over an exercise to do this. So we're gonna just be using a box. The elevation could be dependent on where your flexibility ranges are. But the thing that we classically see is just putting your leg up on something and just rounding forward and stretching. Now, from what we went over in the beginning, we notice if I'm just rounding forward like this, number one, I start to posterior tilt my pelvis like this, but then also I'm just rounding from the back. So yeah, you will feel stretching in the back of the leg, but it's not as effective as it could be to actually bias the tissue, the hamstring muscles, in order to stretch. So by just hanging out like this and leaning forward, yes, we're getting some stretch to the posterior chain, but not as effective as it could be when we're actually taking into consideration the pelvic positioning. So what you want to do is think about the pelvis going into an anterior pelvic tilt versus a posterior pelvic tilt. And the way to do that is you want to think about your pelvis being a cup of water, okay? And from here, you want to spill the water out in front of you. Tip it forward. Get your tail to the ceiling or tail to sky. When you do that, you're going into an anterior pelvic tilt. Now I'm exaggerating it like this to go over the concept here, but you want to think about this as a cup of water. I'm going into an anterior pelvic tilt and I'm dumping it forward. The complete opposite would be a posterior pelvic tilt where we're going the other side, or tucking your tail, which would be pouring the water in back of you. That slacks the hamstrings versus an anterior pelvic tilt stretches the hamstrings. So when we put our leg up in here like this, we just keep that in mind. So from here, I bend my knees slightly, and all I'm gonna think about is just an anterior pelvic tilt of the pelvis. So an anterior pelvic tilt of the pelvis. I tip the water out in the front. As soon as I do that, immediately I start to feel a stretch here. Now, in order to get more of a stretch, all I gotta do is just gently lean forward, and right there, I have a max hamstring stretch going on to the region. That is way more effective and biased to this region versus just simply collapsing forward like this. So we wanna keep that in mind. So up nice and tall, you think about an anterior pelvic tilt, dump the water out in front of you, you'll immediately feel it pulling. Then from here, slight lean forward of the chest, and then you hold this. Now you're stretching the hamstring region way more effectively. The idea here is to build up time under tension. So the classic 30-second stretch and then call it a day doesn't yield any results. We need to get about a 2-minute of time under tension to this region to actually make change to a cellular tissue level. So from here, we're going up, you perform the anterior pelvic tilt, get that stretch going, lean forward. You hold this for 2 minutes of time under tension. After the 2 minutes have been done, we could build isometric contractions in this range to even bias more tissue specific to the hamstring region to gain more flexibility. So say 2 minutes has elapsed. From here, we're gonna stay in this position and drive the heel down really, really hard, building up tension to the hamstrings. Hold that contraction for 10 seconds and then relax. After you're done relaxing, you continue to maintain that mind-body connection of an anterior pelvic tilt, and then you'll be able to slightly lean your chest forward more into the stretch until you feel more of a stretch. Once you feel more of a stretch, you'll hang out into this new position and you repeat the cycle. Now notice as I go further into the stretch, I'm not just collapsing my body forward like this, I'm maintaining an upright chest, so chest up tall, while maintaining that anterior pelvic tilt as I lean forward. That continues to bias more stretching to the hamstrings versus just folding forward. So to recap, leg up on a box, height can vary, but the concept of an anterior pelvic tilt, feel the hamstrings pull, lean your chest forward. Hold that for 2 minutes. After the 2 minutes, contraction down into the hamstrings with your heel driving down for 10 seconds, relax, and then you repeat that about 2 to 3 cycles. You repeat that many times throughout the week and you get consistent to that, your hamstrings will start to feel a lot looser. So progressing the hamstring flexibility exercises with eccentrics is a more focused type of movement to the hamstrings and putting it under load through a lengthening range of motion. This helps flexibility because it builds what's called sarcomeres in series, meaning the actual length of your muscular tissue is actually expanding, helping the extensibility of your muscles. Now we're taking into the concept the pelvis positioning again. So the classic one that we see all over is the Jefferson curl, where we're holding weights or just even body weight and we're doing this curling aspect and going down and we're stretching all of the posterior chain, which is great. However, we're trying to be more specific with the pelvic positioning, and especially in this case, in this video, to understand the concepts. So you want to apply the concepts of moving in that direction, but keeping in mind the pelvis positioning. And we could do it way more effectively. So in this case, we're just gonna go feet shoulder width apart, and we're taking into consideration that anterior pelvic tilt positioning throughout this entire movement. So from here, if I do an anterior pelvic tilt, and I think about mind-body connection of maintaining that with a slight soft knee bend. And as I just bring my chest down, maintaining that, notice my back is straight. I'm not just gonna round like I would in a Jefferson curl, for an example, but anterior pelvic tilt, chest stays tall. As I go down, I'm feeling my hamstrings much more effectively than if I were just to round in the position. You get to the point where you're like, okay, I can't go any further because it's a massive stretch. In that case, you don't push it, then you reset, and you now know where to work into your range of motion. That is biasing your stretch for you way more effectively than just rounding into a position that you don't own, that you don't control, and you're leading to susceptibility of injuring yourself. So from here, again, let's go over it. Feet shoulder width apart, soft knee bend, anterior pelvic tilt, and I'm just gonna keep my chest up tall, back flat as I go down, hamstrings pulling. I get to right around here, and then I come back up. And the concept is when I'm going down, I'm thinking the whole time of getting my butt up towards the ceiling to really bias this stretch. This looks a lot different than if I was just gonna do a Jefferson curl and round. We're being more biased and more intentional using the pelvis positioning. Anterior pelvic tilt, chest tall, and I'm really feeling this. Now progressions to this is holding weights, going further into a range of motion, but you wanna start where what you actually have attainable to you. For an example, you might need to just go to here to feel it enough. Some people will feel this, stretching the hamstrings massively in this range of motion, which is okay. You build off of that. With eccentrics, with this type of movement, I would go higher in rep range, more time under tension, more specificity. 3 sets of 12 to 15, 3 times a week as an example. That's giving you enough of a stimulus to make some change into this region that you're trying to address. So you might feel, if you're starting here, like it's doing nothing. However, over time, you'll start to go further into the range of motion. Then this will be your movement. And then over time, you'll go further down into the range of motion. And then you could add weights. That's how you progress yourself. But at the end of the day, when you zoom back and you focus on the intention behind it, by focusing on the pelvis positioning of how it could be more effective in the stretch that we did in the beginning and applying it to eccentrics, it's the concepts, and then you can make massive, massive improvement by keeping that in mind and progressing with what you actually have. So to recap, in this video, we focused on pelvis positioning and how it could play a huge role into the effectiveness of the hamstring stretches you are doing. We focused on a static one, applying isometric contractions, and we used that same concept with the pelvis position and applied it to a eccentric type of stretch, moving it through a range of motion. The idea with this is the concepts of pelvis positioning throughout these stretches. So I really do hope you gain some insight and value throughout this and understand better why you have to consider that into the stretches you're doing. You apply those concepts, you add consistency to that, your flexibility will drastically improve. You just gotta be patient and consistent. If you did find value in this video, I would greatly appreciate it if you subscribe down below to the channel, like this video, leave any comments down below in the comment section. Let me know what you thought about this video. If it was actually helpful, let me know what other videos you might wanna see. I'm doing my best here and I'm hoping I'm providing you value. Again, thank you. This is Dr. Nick. I'll see you next time.